G'day and welcome to Mark and Sam After Work. Today I just want to do a short video, a little bit of just general knowledge, maybe something that'll help people a little bit with understanding choosing gunpowder and some other bits and pieces of setting up a hand load in the way of gunpowder and primer and things like that. So first off I want to go through and explain what gunpowder is doing and the main features that you're getting when you get different gunpowders. I'm not going to get too complicated in it. If for those who know a bit more about it know that there is single base powders, there's double base powders and there's triple base powders, which are all forms of gunpowder or propellant for munitions. And what we're actually talking about there is either a single or a double or a dual or a triple. Lots of the basic constituents, the ingredients of what goes in the powder, and they do it in different forms. Double base is what we normally use, but then getting into all those details and actually the chemistry of it is not what I'm trying to do here. What I want to explain basically is that with those different ingredients of whichever you are using or whichever the manufacturer is using, there's two fundamentals that you're getting out of gunpowder. One is the amount of energy that gunpowder can produce. Two is the rate in which that explosion happens. Now the explosion, basically the powder needs to be ignited. That starts to burn the powder, which essentially means that it turns from a pellet, from a solid state to a liquid state to a gas state, all in a microsecond or a lot less. And then in the gaseous state is where it burns. It expands rapidly through the burning process. So that creates the explosion. Now, what's actually happening there is, as said, the amount of energy. So different the base mixes of what the gunpowder is made out of create the amount of energy that it's actually producing. And then in the more complicated details, they create how fast that powder burns. What we're actually starting to talk about there is the pressure curve. Now, to make sense of it in the basic level we're talking about is that if you have a longer barrel and you have more, or basically your bullet is going to take, for whatever reason, is going to take a longer time to get out of that barrel. So a heavy bullet means that it's going to take more time to accelerate. Given the same power, it's going to take more time to accelerate as it goes to the end of the barrel. And the longer barrel, the more time it's got, because there's more time for it to accelerate because there's more length. So without getting too complicated there, the simple way to look at that is if you have a short barrel where there's not much time for that bullet to accelerate, then you need a fairly fast burning powder, because ideally what you're doing is you want that explosion, that amount of energy, to be releasing as much of its energy as possible while the bullet is still in the barrel. So a short barrel means you want a fairly fast burning powder, so that explosion happens. All of it happens by the time the bullet's got to the end of it. When you've got a long barrel, well, you want a slower burning powder, so that explosion happens slower, so that once again you want to try and get to the point where most of that energy is being released by the time the bullet gets into the barrel. If you have a slow burning powder in a short barrel, then what's actually going to happen is that there's only a certain amount of that energy is going to be released prior to the bullet escaping the barrel, and then the powder's still going to be burning afterwards. But of course, you're not using that powder anymore, because we're not using that energy anymore, because it's happening, and that's what you see in the way of muzzle flash, that type of thing, where the burn is still happening afterwards. And vice versa. If you have a long barrel and you have a fast burning powder, then most of that energy's gone bang in a crack to start off with, and then the rest of the time the bullet is just coming out where the energy has already been expelled. So you can actually get to the point where the bullet is actually starting to slow down through barrel friction, because their energy's all been released. And more accurately, what happens if your powder burns too fast is too much of that energy is released into just creating pressure, which is not creating acceleration. This is where it gets a little more complicated to understand, and to the explanation I'm going with here is that I can probably assimilate it to the likes of octane in fuel. a lot of people wouldn't realise with higher octane fuel is a slower burning fuel. It's not a higher energy fuel, that's a different thing, it's just a slower burning fuel. And that means that it can create more power because the slower the burn, the more gradual the energy release, the more it pushes on the piston, which creates a better torque curve to create more energy. So higher octane fuel is a little bit like slower burning powder. And just like high octane fuel, it doesn't mean that higher octane or slower burning is better. It just needs to be matched to the place you're using it. So heavier bullet, it's going to take longer to accelerate. You want it to push more gradually against it. You need a slower burning powder. The longer the barrel, once again, you've got more time, so the slower burning powder. This also moves into the same place as a little bit with the case design. Now that can change how that powder is actually, the flame front moves through the case in the powder, how the pressure comes out. There's all sorts of things, and I'm not going to get complicated, but you can find that your case design affects the type of powder that you're going to be using as well. Now generally, as said, this is general information. This is not trying to give you what powder should I use in this. You would do that the normal way. You look up your manufacturers, you read, you Google it, you do all your bits and pieces to find information of what people have found. But this is the understanding of what you're doing. I suppose really what I want to point out is that people who say, I've got a 300 Win Mag, what powder should I use? Well, it really depends on the details. There's so many other details. What bullet you're running, what barrel length you're running, what sort of shooting you're doing, actually all come into play here. What parts you can get, what bullets, cases, all that sort of stuff, all can have an impact on this side of things. So follow all the normal places to find your information, but this is to help understand what's going on. A little bit of what this also moves straight into with that burn rate, all that sort of stuff. It's all instigated by the primer. And I suppose that moves into a couple of things I'll go with. To start off with the primer, what I'm talking about there is a lot of people still are under the impression that if I've got a Magnum cartridge, I need to use a Magnum primer. No, not how it works. It's not what it's about. Yes, they both got Magnum in them, but for the same reason they got Magnum in them is actually talking about the fact that it's just larger. It's just the larger option. It's just more powerful. So in most cases, I only use a standard large rifle primer. I'll tend to use the Federal Gold Medal, always have, I like them, that's what I use. But I will generally use that because in all of the large cartridges that I can. Now the reason I use just the large rifle and not the Magnum large rifle, or the 210 versus the 215, is because I'm after, and that's what I said, it moves into a couple of things with your burn rate and your pressure curves, what we're talking about. Ideally, for a heavy bullet, which I want to shoot in ELR, in a longer barrel, which I want to shoot in ELR, I want the gentlest and most highest horsepower explosion I can get. So I want that pressure curve to push, to start as smoothly as possible and to push as hard as it can the whole time that the bullet's in the barrel. And that's the way I'm going to get the best speed, but I also want that rifle to behave as nicely as possible. And I've found in places, and whether this is just a feeling, I've certainly seen it in groups, but once again, that can be the feeling, the confidence of that side of things. But by using just a normal large rifle primer, I feel they fire a little smoother. So they end up with a little better behavior in the gun, a little less shock because the ignition is a little smoother. And that seems to have worked for me, so that's what I do. The real reason to use a Magnum primer is now in snow conditions, in sub-zero conditions, in very slow burning powder or hard to ignite powder, the type of powder you're running, that sort of stuff, then that's where the Magnum primer is involved. It doesn't need a bigger primer to start the fire, unless it needs a bigger primer to start the fire. So what I'm trying to say is just because there's a lot more powder doesn't mean you need a big primer. It's much more about the type of powder that you're actually running. So even in the 50 BMG powder, I have used successfully normal primers, but really up to the 2218 is the sort of powder that I'm using. Oh, listen, I won't go down that road, that gets complicated, but even in my 375 Shytac improved, I can use a normal large rifle primer. Certainly in the 300 Win mags, the likes of the 300 rum, all that sort of stuff, I can use that, and I found that result. But that would depend on your powder and your conditions. Like I said, sub-zero, you probably go to the Magnum primer regardless to make sure you get a proper ignition point because the temperature is so much colder. And I suppose that's where, there's a couple of other details that people need to understand in powder and that sort of stuff. Very much follow what the guides say, but the other thing that you quite commonly hear is people running shorter barrels and still trying to run the same powders. And really you should be switching back to a different powder once you go with a shorter barrel. People running compensators or running suppressors, moderators, basically a can on the end of your rifle to quieten things down. And some people feeling that actually is like adding onto the barrel because they have this, and you'll get a little bit of a speed increase in some cases. Not in all cases, but yes, you do. The reason for the speed increase or the little bit of speed in the bullet side of things is probably the fact that for the first part of the suppressor, the gas that's still forcing out the end of the barrel is actually helping the bullet to not start slowing down straight away. Maybe give it a tiny bit more speed, or maybe it's simply the fact that the charge they're running is really more suited to a longer barrel and there's still enough gas and enough explosion happening that it actually is helping the bullet along a little bit inside the actual suppressor. So I suppose that's it. Like I said, it's general information. It's not trying to be a place where you can figure out what powder you should be using. You should go to the manufacturer's recommendations. You should go through there and actually start to make sense of things of what they're talking about. If they're not listed, it's not a powder you've used before, then do some Googling. See what the shooting groups are using, see what they're finding. But that's a basic understanding of, as said, there's two main things that you're actually looking for. One, what powder is designed around. One is the amount of energy, and the next is the pressure curve, or how is how slow it actually burns, or how fast it actually burns. The speed, the burn rate, which isn't just a one-size-fits-all. It's not just a set thing. It is about that pressure curve and where that explosion happens, how fast it happens, how it pushes, and that side of things. And that's also where some of the manufacturers are really pushing the envelope and getting more and more speed out of bullets by getting that curve to work in a better place for them. And I suppose that's the last bit I'd end up on, is that yes, as I mentioned with the large rifle primers versus the Magnum primers, there is the two things that we're actually after in how a powder actually works in the rifle. One is the amount of speed we can get out of it, so that's certainly relevant. We're trying to get, as in most cases, as much speed as we can get, but that's always going to balance to how well the rifle groups. And that's a couple of things. That's actually talking about this harmonics and all that side of things, whether that's seating depth, or that's charge levels, or that's barrel tuners, all the things you're talking about there. But there's another detail that you've got to keep in mind, is that the smoother that rifle actually functions, the more likely it is to be able to hold a good group. The fundamentals, all the barrel tuner side of things, or the seating depths, or all those sort of things, are presuming that rifle is performing perfectly every time. And a lot of the times you're going to find it's not going to be. So to have that charge work as smoothly for you as you can, you get your form right, then those other little features that you can put on top of it are really supposed to be, as I would have said in previous videos, taking a 1/2 inch group and making it smaller. Getting down to your 1/2 inch group is all in getting your load combination working properly, getting your form shooting properly, and in some cases making sure you've got the right powder to suit what you're doing. Anyway guys, that's just a bit of general information. Hope that was help some people, if nothing more than a little bit interesting. Thanks for checking in on us, and we'll catch you next time.